I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, staring at the reflection that seemed both familiar and foreign. The woman looking back at me had lost weight, her cheeks slightly hollowed, but her eyes held a spark I hadn't seen in months. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted my gym bag strap, a designer piece that now felt like it belonged to another life. The morning sun filtered through the frosted window, casting a soft glow that made everything feel dreamlike. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and for the past 20 years, I've done everything society expected of me. I married my college sweetheart, built a beautiful home in suburban Connecticut, and raised a son who became more than I could have ever dreamed. But sometimes doing everything right still leads you wrong. James was already gone when I woke up. Not that I expected anything different. These days, he always left before dawn, his expensive cologne the only trace he was ever here. No note on the kitchen counter. No text message asking about my day. Just his empty coffee mug in the sink. A ring of brown staining the white porcelain. That's what our marriage had become. A series of traces. Evidence that we still shared a space, if not a life. I told myself it was normal. That after 20 years of marriage, things change. People change. But lately, the silence in our house felt deafening. Like a scream nobody could hear. Mom? You ready? Ethan's voice carried up the stairs. Warm and familiar. My son, my rock. He'd been there through every fever-ridden night. Every dizzy spell. Every moment when pneumonia had left me gasping for air. While James buried himself in legal briefs and client meetings, Ethan made sure I ate, took my medication, stayed hydrated. I grabbed my water bottle and headed downstairs, finding him leaning against our granite kitchen counter, his own gym bag slung over his shoulder. At 25, he was the spitting image of his father at that age. But where James had always been ambitious and distant, Ethan was present, attentive, maybe too attentive. Ready as I'll ever be, I managed, trying to match his encouraging smile. My stomach was doing somersaults, but I couldn't let him see my nervousness. The Connecticut summer hit us like a wall of heat when we stepped outside. Even at 8 in the morning, the air was thick and heavy, making my newly recovered lungs work harder than they should. Sweat began to bead on my skin before we reached Ethan's car. You sure you're up for this? His eyes held that protective look I'd grown used to. The one that made me feel both cared for and fragile. I have to be, I said firmly. Because weakness wasn't an option anymore. I couldn't keep being the sick wife, the absent gym member, the woman whose life had shrunk to the size of her bedroom. The local fitness center hadn't changed, but somehow it felt different. Music pumped through the speakers. The clash of W. Eights and whir of treadmills created a familiar symphony. People waved, called out welcome backs, their genuine warmth both touching and overwhelming. I smiled and nodded, pretending their concern didn't make me feel like an invalid. Ethan guided me through basic stretches, his hands occasionally steadying my balance. each touch sending conflicting signals through my nervous system. "Remember, push yourself, but don't overdo it," he said, watching as I loaded weights onto the bar. The burn in my muscles felt good, like waking up from a long sleep. My body remembered this, craved it even. The simple satisfaction of movement and strength. By the time we finished, I was drenched in sweat but feeling lighter, as if I'd left some of my burdens on the gym floor. We were wiping down the equipment when Ethan's phone buzzed. "Rachel texted," he said casually. "She's already cooking. We should head straight there." I froze, my hand still clutching the sanitizing wipe. Dinner at the Thompsons meant small talk, laughter, and maintaining the facade of suburban perfection. I wasn't sure I had the energy for that. But going home meant an empty house, silence that echoed off the walls, and another night of James working late. "Let's go," I said, adjusting my bag on my shoulder. Ethan's face lit up, and he held the door open for me. The heat hit us again, but somehow it felt different now. Less oppressive, more alive. The drive to Rachel and Mike's lakeside home was short, but my mind wandered to dangerous places. I thought about James, about how he used to hold doors open for me, how his smile used to light up rooms, how somewhere along the way, we'd become strangers who shared a mortgage. Rachel's house appeared through the trees, all modern lines and glass walls, a testament to Mike's success in real estate. I caught my reflection in the car window. Flushed face, damp hair, looking nothing like the polished suburban wife I was supposed to be. "You look fine, Mom," Ethan said, reading my mind as he often did lately. His hand squeezed my shoulder, lingering perhaps a moment too long. Rachel met us at the door, her perfect blonde highlights catching the sun. "Sarah!" "Finally!" she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that smelled of expensive perfume. "We've missed you at book club." I forced a smile, remembering how I used to enjoy these social obligations before illness made me see through their superficiality. Mike appeared behind her, casual in designer jeans, grinning like we were all sharing some private joke. "The prodigal gymgoer returns," he laughed, wrapping an arm around Rachel's waist. The casual intimacy of the gesture made my chest ache. Inside, the house was cool and pristine, smelling of garlic and herbs. Rachel led us to the kitchen, where she and Mike moved around each other with practiced ease, sharing small touches and knowing looks. I leaned against their marble counter, sipping water and watching their choreographed domesticity, wondering when James and I had lost that dance. My phone buzzed in my pocket. "Working late. Don't wait up. J." 5 words. That's what 20 years of marriage had come to. I slipped the phone back into my bag, ignoring the way Ethan's eyes followed the movement, the way he could probably read the disappointment on my face. "Sarah, you're quiet tonight," Rachel said, setting down a glass of wine I hadn't asked for. "What's going on in that head of yours?" "Nothing," I said too quickly. "Just tired from the gym." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was the way Ethan kept watching me. The way James didn't watch me anymore. The way my life felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse with the slightest breeze. Dinner was a blur of conversation I barely followed. Rachel talked about her interior design business. Mike shared stories about his latest property developments. And Ethan charmed everyone with tales from the gym. I pushed food around my plate, nodding at appropriate intervals, while my mind kept circling back to dangerous thoughts. When had Ethan's laugh started to sound like music? When had James's absence started to feel like relief? When had I started noticing these things? The evening stretched on, filled with the kind of casual intimacy that only highlighted what was missing in my own life. Rachel and Mike's easy affection, their shared glances, their synchronized movements. All of it felt like a spotlight on my own failed marriage. By the time we said our goodbyes, I felt drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical exercise. The drive home was quiet, but the silence between Ethan and me felt charged, like the air before a storm. We pulled into our driveway, the house dark except for the porch light James always forgot to turn off. Empty, like so many nights before. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the workout endorphins. Or maybe it was just 20 years of loneliness finally reaching a breaking point. Ethan followed me inside, his presence both comforting and unsettling. The house felt smaller somehow, the air thicker. "Hungry?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Starving," I admitted, realizing I'd barely touched my dinner at Rachel's. He disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a bag of popcorn and 2 sodas. Just like when he was younger. We settled onto the couch. The familiar routine of sharing a bowl of popcorn, fighting over the buttery pieces, laughing about nothing in particular. But something had shifted. The air between us charged with an electricity that shouldn't exist. I caught him watching me, his eyes darker than usual, and my heart started racing for reasons I didn't want to examine. The night stretched ahead of us, full of possibility and danger, and I wasn't sure which scared me more. The fact that I was noticing these things, or the fact that I couldn't stop noticing them. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a house where everything else felt frozen, suspended between what was proper and what was possible, between what I should want and what I did want. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispered that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The popcorn bowl sat empty between us, a barrier that felt both too small and too large. "You cheated," I accused playfully, watching Ethan pop the last buttery piece into his mouth. "I played fair," he shot back, his grin making him look younger, more like the boy he used to be. "You're just slower than me now." I grabbed a throw pillow, launching it at his head. He caught it easily, laughing that deep laugh that seemed to fill the empty spaces in our home. "Oh, it's like that?" he challenged, reaching for another pillow. Before I knew what was happening, We were engaged in a full-on pillow fight. Like when he was little. Except nothing about this felt little anymore. His movements were controlled. Powerful. And when he finally caught me, pinning me against the couch, the laughter died in my throat. We froze. His body hovering over mine. Close enough that I could feel his heart racing. Or maybe that was mine. "Mom," he whispered. His voice rough with something I didn't want to name. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think about anything except how wrong this was. And how right it felt. "We should stop," I managed. But my hands betrayed me. Still gripping his shirt. His eyes searched mine. Dark and intense. Full of questions I was afraid to answer. Should we? The words hung between us. Heavy with possibility. I knew I should push him away. Should get up. Should remember who we were. What we were. Instead, I stayed still. Caught in a moment that felt both eternal and fleeting. His hand moved to my face. Fingers trembling slightly as they brushed my cheek. The touch was gentle. Tentative. Like he was afraid I might break. Or run. Or both. "This is wrong," I whispered. Even as I leaned into his touch. "Everything's wrong," he replied. His thumb tracing my jawline. "Dad doesn't see you anymore. He doesn't see how amazing you are. How strong. How beautiful." Each word felt like a key unlocking something inside me. Something that should have stayed locked away. "Ethan, please," I breathed. But I wasn't sure if I was asking him to stop. Or begging him to continue. The house was quiet around us. The tick of the clock the only sound besides our breathing. Outside, a car passed by. Its headlights sweeping across the walls. Reminding me that the world still existed beyond this moment. But in here, time felt suspended. Reality bent and twisted into something unrecognizable. His face was closer now. So close I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Eyes that had always been so much like his father's. Yet somehow entirely different. When his lips met mine, it was soft. Questioning. Nothing like the desperate act of rebellion I'd imagined this kind of moment would be. It felt like coming home. And leaving home. All at once. My hands moved of their own accord. Sliding up his chest. Around his neck. Pulling him closer even as my mind screamed to push him away. The kiss deepened. Became something hungry. Desperate. Years of loneliness and need pouring into this one forbidden moment. His hands tangled in my hair. Gentle yet possessive. And I lost myself in the sensation. In the feeling of being wanted. Needed. Seen. When we finally broke apart. Reality crashed back like a wave. I pushed at his chest. And he moved immediately. Sitting back on his heels. His eyes wide with a mixture of desire and horror. "Oh God," I breathed. Pressing my fingers to my lips. Still feeling the ghost of his kiss. "Mom, I'm sorry," he started. But I was already standing, my legs shaking beneath me. "We can't," I said, my voice breaking. "This never happened." I fled upstairs, locking myself in my bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was flushed, lips slightly swollen, eyes bright with tears and something else. I didn't recognize her anymore. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, followed by the roar of Ethan's car engine. He was leaving, running away from what we'd done, what we'd almost done. I slid down to the floor, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to make sense of how we'd gotten here. The night stretched endlessly ahead, filled with the weight of consequences I couldn't begin to face. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, as if the sky itself was judging what had transpired beneath it. I stayed there until my legs went numb, until the first rays of dawn began to creep under the bathroom door. James would be getting up soon, putting on his suit, grabbing his coffee, leaving for another day at the office. He wouldn't notice my red eyes, my trembling hands, the way I couldn't quite meet his gaze. He hadn't noticed anything about me in years. When I finally crawled into bed, the sheets felt cold and foreign against my skin. Sleep wouldn't come. Couldn't come. Not with my mind replaying every moment, every touch, every whispered word. The morning arrived too quickly, bringing with it the harsh light of reality. I heard James moving around downstairs, the familiar sounds of his morning routine, a routine that no longer included me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Taking some time off. Going to stay with Mark for a while. Ethan. The words blurred through my tears, each letter a reminder of what we'd done, what we'd broken. I typed and deleted a dozen responses, finally settling on nothing at all. What could I possibly say? The house felt emptier than ever. The silence heavier, more accusing. I called in sick to work, my voice steady even as my hands shook. The day stretched ahead of me, endless and hollow. I wandered from room to room, touching things that reminded me of simpler times. Ethan's high school graduation photo, James's and my wedding picture, family vacations frozen in frames. Everything looked different now, tainted by what had happened, by what I had allowed to happen. The guilt was a living thing, coiling in my stomach, wrapping around my throat. But underneath it, hidden in the darkest corners of my heart, was something else. A spark of life I hadn't felt in years. A reminder that I wasn't just James's wife, or Ethan's mother, but a woman who could still feel, still want, still burn. And that terrified me more than anything else. The rain started around noon, pattering against the windows, nature's own soundtrack to my unraveling. I sat in the kitchen, staring at James's coffee mug in the sink, wondering when exactly we'd stopped trying, when comfort had become complacency, when love had become habit. My phone remained silent. No messages from Ethan, No calls from James. Just the endless tick of the clock, marking time in a house that felt more like a museum of what used to be than a home of what was. The afternoon bled into evening, and still I sat, trapped between what I should do and what I wanted to do, between the life I'd built and the life that seemed to be crumbling around me, between right and wrong. Though those lines had become so blurred, I wasn't sure I could see them anymore. Outside, the storm grew stronger, lightning illuminating the kitchen in brief, harsh flashes, thunder rolling across the sky like judgment. I jumped when my phone finally buzzed. But it was only Rachel, asking if I was coming to book club next week. Such a normal question, in a world that no longer felt normal at all. I left it unanswered. Like so many things that day, the night crept in, bringing with it shadows and memories of touches that shouldn't have happened, of feelings that shouldn't exist. I knew I should eat something, should try to sleep, should try to pretend everything was fine. Instead, I stayed in the kitchen, watching the storm, wondering if somewhere out there, Ethan was watching it too, wondering if he was thinking of me, the way I couldn't stop thinking of him, wondering if this was how it felt when a life carefully built over decades finally began to fall apart. The next few days passed in a blur, each one bleeding into the next, marked only by James's departures and returns, his presence growing more distant with each passing hour. He noticed something was wrong. I could tell by the way his eyes lingered on me at breakfast. But he didn't ask. Maybe he was afraid of the answer. Maybe I was afraid of what I might say. The gym felt empty without Ethan. The weights too. Oh, heavy. The mirrors too honest. People asked where he was, and I gave them the practiced lie. Visiting friends for a while. Each word tasted like ash in my mouth. It was during one of these lonely workouts that James finally spoke up, his voice cutting through my thoughts like a knife. "I think we should see someone," he said, standing in our bedroom doorway one evening, tie loosened but not removed. A therapist. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. I looked at him then, really looked at him, saw the gray at his temples, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we met. "Okay," I said. Because what else could I say? Because maybe this was the lifeline we needed, or at least the one we were supposed to want. The first session was on a Tuesday, in an office that smelled of leather and coffee. Dr. Anderson was younger than I expected, with kind eyes and a voice that made you want to trust her. "Tell me about your marriage," she said. And I watched James's hands clench on the armrests. We talked about distance, about silence, about how somewhere along the way, we'd stopped seeing each other. We didn't talk about Ethan. I couldn't. Some secrets are too heavy to share, too dangerous to acknowledge. James promised to try harder, to be home more, to see me again. I promised to give him the chance, to remember why we fell in love, to forget things I shouldn't remember. But at night, alone in our bed, I couldn't stop my mind from wandering. Couldn't stop feeling the ghost of different hands, hearing different words. My phone stayed silent. No messages from Ethan, though I knew from Rachel that he was still at Mark's, still taking some time. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly, painfully, we tried to rebuild. James started coming home earlier, bringing takeout and stories from work. I listened and smiled, played my part in this reconstruction, even as something inside me remained broken. We went to dinner parties, smiled for photos, pretended everything was normal. Rachel watched me with knowing eyes, but never asked the questions I could see forming on her lips. Then one day, as summer began to fade into fall, Ethan came home. I was in the kitchen when I heard his car pull up. The sound of his key in the lock. Footsteps I would know anywhere. My hands froze on the coffee mug I was washing. James's mug. The one that had started it all. Mom? His voice was different somehow. Older maybe. Or just changed by everything that had happened between us. I turned slowly, forcing myself to breathe, to remember who we were supposed to be. He stood in the doorway, tanned from the summer sun, looking more like his father than ever. But his eyes were all his own, filled with things we couldn't say. Welcome home, I managed, the words catching in my throat. He nodded, staying where he was, maintaining a distance. That felt both necessary and unbearable. Dad told me you're seeing someone, he said. A therapist. We are, I confirmed, wondering if he could hear the uncertainty in my voice. That's good, he said. But his eyes said something else entirely. We stood there, the kitchen counter between us like a barrier, like protection from ourselves. I got a job offer, he finally said. In California. The words hit me like physical blows, each one stealing a little more air from my lungs. California, I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. He nodded again, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, like he was trying to keep them from reaching out. I think it's best, he said softly. For everyone. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, to beg him to stay. Instead, I gripped the counter harder, knuckles turning white with the effort of holding myself together. When do you leave? End of the month. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to say goodbye. To pretend this was normal. To act like my heart wasn't being torn in two. Mom, he started, taking a step forward, then stopping himself. I need you to be okay with this. I looked at him then. My son. My sin. My heart breaking in ways I never thought possible. I'll try, I whispered. Because that's what mothers do. They let go. Even when it kills them. He left shortly after. The house feeling emptier than ever. I stood in the kitchen, staring at nothing, until James came home. He found me there, still standing, still staring. "Everything okay?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Ethan's moving to California," I said, the words hollow in my mouth. James nodded, like he already knew, like he understood. But he didn't. He couldn't. That night, in our carefully reconstructed marriage, I lay awake listening to James breathe, wondering if this was what healing felt like, or just another kind of breaking. Outside, the first leaves of fall began to turn, nature's reminder that everything changes. Everything ends. Everything falls. And sometimes, the only thing left to do is let it. The last 2 weeks passed too quickly, each day bringing us closer to goodbye. Each moment waited with things unsaid. I helped Ethan pack, folding his life into boxes, pretending my hands didn't shake when they brushed against his. James took time off work, organized a going-away party, played the role of proud father perfectly. No one saw how I broke a little more each day, how every sealed box felt like another piece of my heart being packed away. The party was at Rachel and Mike's. Of course. Their lakeside home filled with friends and family, all celebrating Ethan's new beginning. I wore my best dress, painted on my brightest smile, accepted hugs and shared memories, while inside, everything screamed, "You must be so proud," people kept saying. And I nodded, because that's what mothers do. They celebrate when their children leave, even if it feels like dying. Ethan worked the room like his father, charming and confident, but his eyes kept finding mine across the crowd, each glance a conversation we couldn't have. As the sun set over the lake, casting everything in golden light, he found me on the deck, away from the noise and the pretense. "Mom," he said softly, standing closer than he should, farther than he wanted. "I need you to know something." I gripped the railing harder, watching the light dance on the water. "Don't," I whispered. "Please." But he continued, his voice low and urgent. "I'm not running away because I regret anything. I'm running because I don't." The words hit me like waves, threatening to pull me under. "We can't," I said. The same words I'd said that night. But they felt different now, heavier with finality. "I know," he replied, and I heard the pain in his voice, matched only by the ache in my chest. "But I needed you to know." Inside, someone called his name. The moment shattered like glass. He touched my shoulder briefly, a gesture that could look innocent to anyone watching, but set my skin on fire. Then he was gone. Back to the party. Back to pretending. The next morning dawned clear and cool. A perfect fall day for leaving. James helped load the moving truck, gave Ethan advice about California traffic, hugged him with genuine pride and love. I stood in the driveway, watching my world shift on its axis. When it was time for final goodbyes, Ethan hugged his father first, then turned to me. The embrace was brief, appropriate, nothing like the storm raging in both our hearts. "I love you, Mom," he said. Words that should have been simple, should have been pure. "I love you too," I replied, meaning it in ways I shouldn't. Then he was gone, the moving truck disappearing down our street, taking with it pieces of me I'd never get back. James squeezed my shoulder, misreading my tears as normal maternal grief. "He'll be fine," he said. "They always are." I nodded, unable to speak, unable to explain that I wasn't crying for Ethan's future, but for everything we'd lost, everything we'd found, everything we could never have. The house felt different after he left, emptier somehow, though his room remained largely unchanged. James and I continued our therapy sessions, talking about communication and connection, while the biggest secret of all sat heavy on my tongue. Weeks passed, then months. Ethan called regularly, his voice carefully neutral, telling us about his new job, his new apartment, his new life. I listened and responded appropriately, playing my part in this distance we'd created. James and I settled into a new routine, one that looked more like a marriage should. We had dinner together most nights, shared stories about our days, even started taking weekend trips again. From the outside, everything looked perfect, healed. But late tea night, when James was asleep beside me, I would sometimes touch my lips, remembering a kiss that should never have happened, a moment that changed everything and nothing. I thought about choices, about roads not taken, about the fine line between love and destruction. I thought about Ethan, somewhere on the other side of the country, carrying the same memories, the same secrets, the same scars. And I wondered if this was what redemption felt like. This quiet ache, this gentle breaking, this slow return to what should be, rather than what could have been. The seasons changed. Life moved forward, as it always does. James and I found our way back to each other. Not to what we were before, but to something new, something different, something real. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments, I felt the ghost of different hands, heard the echo of different words, well, that was my secret to keep. Because some stories don't have happy endings. They just have endings. And sometimes, that has to be enough. And